everyone. All right. We are continuing with Franz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, looking at the second essay we're reading from that collection, The Trials and Tribulations of National Consciousness. I think this feels like a major departure, the Fanon reading from what we've done previously in class. And I think one thing I've been sort of struggling with is trying to connect the Fanon and also the Marx, for that matter, to the ethical theories we've been talking about. So to try to make that connection, again, I want to just reiterate a couple things. Returning to the Marx reading, the German ideology, what we're seeing there is the conflict between idealism and materialism, and the argument that idealism is not a good way to sort of evaluate the real situation. The idealism of equality, for example, equality of laws, equality of rhetoric, equality as a kind of intellectual question is one thing. And then what we call equity, or more material equality, is not guaranteed by the idea of equality, the ideal of equality. That even in the presence of the ideal of equality, all kinds of inequality remain possible and continue. And so, right, the sort of challenge is to hold that idealism accountable using material standards. And more generally, to raise this question or this problem, point out this problem that idealism is not enough, right? Idealism does not always actually accomplish what it claims to accomplish or what it means to accomplish. And to think about power, the operations of power, the movements of power, the logic of power, as being independent from idealism. What I mean is that power, by power I mean those people, institutions, offices that rule in government, that the operations of that kind of power need to be analyzed on their own, materially, and not ideally. That the dimension of power can't be contained with mere idealism. We can't think our way to equality. We can't think our way to justice. These things require material responses. They require action, right? And so I think we see this with Fanon, as we saw with Marx, right? For Marx, power uh, is not in the bourgeois state committed to the kind of equality that was promised in democratic revolutions. The ideals of the bourgeois state, right, espouse one thing, but the operations of power within the bourgeois state uh, point to something very different. Uh, Power, in general, seeks to reproduce itself, and those that have power seek to hold on to power, regardless of the ideology, the ideas that are espoused by that power. Uh, so for Marx, the power that was being critiqued from a material standpoint was the power of the the bourgeoisie, right? The rich, the land and property owning class, which for Marx is the ruling class in the bourgeois state, and will do, right, no matter how much it professes a desire for equality, it will do whatever it takes to remain the ruling class. For Fanon, the ruling class, the power that is to be critiqued, is not just the bourgeoisie, the economic power, but also a cultural power, the power of of whiteness, right? That again, for Fanon, the ideal that the ideal of racial equality, that can be espoused, right? One can say, I believe in racial equality, but merely saying it doesn't make one, doesn't clear one of the material implications of racism. The disconnect here is between the ideal of racial equality, racial justice, and the actual material work of achieving that kind of equality. So Fanon is thinking about the way that power in a racial context reproduces itself, how white supremacy reproduces itself, and is able to continue to exist even when it espouses the doctrine of racial equality. So let me try and say a little bit about the relevance of this question and sort of the themes that we're dealing with here for our world today. Here we are, it's November 3rd. I'm recording this on Election Day 2020. And one of the major sort of debates that we've had over the last 4 or 5 years with respect to race and racism is about the relation between uh, economic inequality and racial inequality. Uh, and there are sort of two extremes in this. Um, this was an argument that was really hot, I don't know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 2017, 18. Um, on the one hand, you have uh, well, let me step back and expand a little bit. The discussion is about uh, how to solve racism uh, and whether or not that's possible. Um, to solve racism, what does that mean? In another book by Fanon, book called White Skin, Black Masks, Black Skin, White Masks. In this book, Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon describes the project of anti-racism as the disalienation of, he says, the black man. But obviously, we can expand that, right? The disalienation of black people in general. And Fanon means that both in terms of a disalienation from society to make the black population more integrated, more of a sort of a less alienated group. But he also means it in terms of disalienation from yourself as a black person. Right now, this is the sort of awkwardness of being a white teacher and trying to explain Fanon. Right, Fanon is writing very much as a black man for a black audience, so it's always awkward and feels a little bit like trespassing for anyway to me as a white person to be sort of teaching this stuff. But I think it's very important to teach this stuff. I think it's very important to read this stuff and understand it. In any case, right? So what he means by this disalienation is the way that the racism of colonialism, the racism of slavery, lead to an alienation within the colonized person, and within the black person, in the black soul. No, I'm sorry, Fanon would not say soul. And that alienation, that self-alienation, to be alienated from yourself, has to do with what he calls, again, in Black Skin, White Masks, a double consciousness. Consciousness that you have one way of being with the other colonized people and another way of being with the colonizer. That there is this double pull. On the one hand, to reject the culture of the colonizer, and on the other hand, to assimilate to the culture of the colonizer. Now, all right, I'm already on a tangent, right? So the purpose of anti-racist work, according to Fanon, is the disalienation of black people from themselves and from society. Uh, and so then the question is, how can this be achieved? What are sort of what are the causes of racism, and what perpetuates it? Uh, so we've seen Fanon's answer to what causes racism, and in this next essay, we see a little bit more about what perpetuates it. Um, for Fanon, what causes racism is colonialism, right? Um, so let's put a pin in that. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Right? What causes racism for Fanon is colonialism. Colonialism is what generates modern racism, and modern racism would be distinguished from tribalism or nationalism. So we'll think a little bit more about what specifically racism is. But putting a pin in that, returning to this theme, I began the relevance of Fanon to today, and this debate that was going on, has been going on, well, for much longer than the last 5 years, but in kind of popular discourse, in Twitter discourse, for the last 5 years. And that's the debate between, on the one hand, right, so there's sort of two extremes in the debate about how to disalienate the Black community. On the one hand, there are the race reductionists, those who believe that the racial inequality in this country and around the world, but let's focus on this country for just this argument, that inequality is caused by racism. Racism is caused by racism, right? And this argument would roughly lean on the idea that there's a kind of natural racism and within people, and that we need to simply learn to overcome that natural racism. Right? This idea is essentially right. A racist is a kind of ignorant person, and in that ignorance, they are betraying a kind of natural state, a natural sort of apprehension and suspicion, and even dislike or antagonism toward those who are different from us. That racism is kind of the natural state of human being, and that the way out of racism, the way to solve racism, is education and experience, right? So we need diversity because diversity provides the opportunity to interact with and learn from members of different ethnic backgrounds, different races, different right traditions, and through that education, through that enlightenment, one overcomes one's sort of natural default racism. So that is the race reductionist argument. Everything can be boiled down to simple racial difference and kind of inherent natural ignorance about racial difference that causes racism. Now, one you know, there's sort of no definitive answer to this, but one thing we might mention in connection to that is uh, the nature of relations between different peoples prior to the modern period. In other words, prior to the colonial period. Because the modern period, however you break that down, that historical era, and everyone does it a different way. But roughly speaking, the modern age, whether it begins in 1500 or 1650 or 1750, whenever you like, is going to be defined by colonialism and imperialism of the European countries. So modern racism is inherently connected to colonialism because modernity is inherently connected to colonialism and imperialism. So what did the relationship between peoples look like prior to colonialism, prior to the modern world? Because there were, of course, relations between, the the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Eritreans, the Persians and the Greeks, the English and the Spanish and the Moors. All kinds of relations. And what we don't find is the concept of race as it's defined in the modern period. All right, so I guess this is just going to be my lecture of tangents. Not tangents. It's all connected. It's all part of the same story. So what you find in history prior to colonialism is tribalism, nationalism, and to some extent, right, religious discrimination. Discrimination against the Jews, certainly, in Christian countries. Discrimination against Christians in pagan countries before that. Right, so religious discrimination, certainly. Tribal enmity and national conflict, of course. What you don't find is a concept of race as such. In the modern period, really in the 18th century, with a number of primarily German philosophers, and importantly, Kant plays a major role in this. We have the development of a quote-unquote scientific concept of race. Now, let me immediately say that this is not a scientific concept. There is no scientific concept of race. Race is not a scientific category, to the extent that there are empirical differences. They are very minor, aesthetic, superficial. For example, there is no difference between races when it comes to something like brain power or processing power or strength or any sort of essential feature. There's no difference from one race to another. Scientifically speaking, there is no phylogenic, there is no, what's the word I'm looking for? Categorical, meaningful difference from one race to another, one people to another. The quote-unquote scientific concept of race, the sort of philosophical concept of race, is essentially a concept of history that says there are 4 basic races of the human species. And these races are genetic differences. Most importantly, right? The reason why race is an historical category, historical concept, and not a scientific concept, is that what race really did, the concept of race really did for 18th century philosophers like Kant, is explain the destiny of peoples, explain why Europeans develop certain kinds of technology, for example, writing, phonetic writing, and certain other people's races do not. Right? How do we explain the cultural difference between 18th century Germany, 18th century China, and 18th century Senegal? Right? Well, today, right, we would explain those differences materially by giving a material history and explaining, right, what resources were available to different peoples, why certain kinds of knowledge and certain intellectual activity took off in certain places around the world and not in other places. The material conditions that make certain kinds of advancement possible. So there would be nothing about the people themselves that makes that kind of advancement inevitable or impossible. It is just the material history of those peoples that leads to advancement or not. This material history, right, was not part of 18th century philosophy. Right? We don't really get full-throated philosophical defense of materialism until Marx. And so in place of that material history that would explain the differences between people in the way I just described, we get this idealistic explanation of those differences to say, well, the European has more technological and academic advancement, more scientific knowledge than the people of Senegal or Congo, because, according to these 18th century German philosophers, the white race is essentially and inherently, and according to God's ordainment, superior. It is destined for further advancement, for this higher achievement. Right? And so these four races, which would be the European white race, the Asian race, the black race, and the Native American Amerindian race of North and South America, those are Kant's four definitions of race. And those would be understood not historically, not materially, but right, using sort of 18th century science, essentially. There is an essence to these races, and those essences determine their historical trajectory, meaning the essence of the white race destines it for technological advancement. The essence of the Amerindian race destines it for its own degree of advancement. And that degree of advancement is evidence for these 18th century idealist philosophers of the superiority of the white race, right? So that superiority is always justified by scientific, intellectual, technological advancement, right? That's what theoretically justifies this claim of superiority. Now, I've already said, right, that science is bunk, is not science at all. There's no empirical evidence to support that, right? There can be no empirical evidence of the essence of a people, nor can there be any evidence of the destiny of a people, right? What Kant and other philosophers like him are doing when they're doing that kind of quote unquote race science is uh, looking at history and again essentializing it, right? Saying this is the only way history could have gone. History is ordained by God. It is following an essential plan, and what has happened is meant to happen, right? The European has greater technological advancement because they were meant to, because they are essentially superior, viewed as superior by God. Uh, so nothing scientific about this, nothing empirical, nothing beyond sort of the imagination of the Europeans who were at that very time, right, looking for explanations uh, for the relationship between Europeans and the inhabitants of the rest of the world who had been, encountered relatively recently with the age of discovery, quote unquote, and the beginning of colonial projects. And so you can see how this sort of philosophy of race and this phony race science would have been an enormous benefit to the colonists who are, going and taking over other countries, right? Installing themselves as rulers around the world. That kind of racist, quote unquote, science, that pseudoscience, is an excellent justification for colonialism. So, prior to the modern period, prior to the period of colonialism, the age of colonialism and imperialism, national imperialism, there is no concept of race in that sense, and there is no sense that one people is inherently, essentially, and according to God, superior to another. The Greeks would say that Greek culture is superior to Persian culture, and you'll see, the Greeks talking about the Persians disparagingly as a group, stereotyping them, and that sort of thing, right? That kind of tribalism. But this idea but what you won't find is the belief that the Greeks are ordained by the gods to be superior to the Trojans or the Persians, right? Persians and the Greeks have different gods, and right when they fight in war, it is a fight between equal enemies. It's that that kind of tribalism, that kind of centralization, stereotyping of an enemy is different than the paternalism, the chauvinism, and the sort of control exerted by the colonist. Right, there is no war between colonizer and colonized. That's a really important distinction. Anyway, so we might then say to the race reductionist that there hasn't always been a concept of race, that prior to the modern period, it would have been nonsensical to talk about racial superiority because there was no concept of race as such. And while there was this kind of animosity between, for example, Greeks and Persians, you would not find the Greeks arguing seriously that the Persians were subhuman, were a lesser kind of human, right? They might say Persian culture is X, Y, and Z. And of course, that is, stereotyping is tribalism is a kind of oppression and is not good. Um, but it's not going to take the form of a claim of uh, that the group is subhuman, right? That there is this fundamental biological inequality between them, or even deep historical inequality. So the idea that racism is simply an effect of race, well, perhaps, but only if we recognize that the concept of race itself is an invention, is a useful invention in the suppression of one race by another. So, yeah, if you want to acknowledge that, then you might say yes. But then you have to ask, right, why was race, the concept of race, in the first place invented? So the racial reductionists are, in my view, uh, unable to unable to explain the origin of racism in a convincing way. And more generally, unable to explain why racism persists after education, after one is no longer ignorant, after one knows that race is that races are the races are equal in all important measurements. So, on the other hand, then we'll have the class reductionist. And this argument will go something like this. Race is in fact a kind of subspecies of class. And that racism is an effect of class differences. Racial inequality is an effect of class differences. And that if it were just possible to raise more Black Americans out of poverty into the middle class, into the upper class, if there were greater economic equality, there would be less racial inequality. That one racism directed toward anti-Black racism is really not so different than the anti-poor attitude of many people. That in essence, what makes people racist, or rather that the negative effects of racism would be eradicated if there was just more wealth in the Black community. The suffering of the Black community could be alleviated through greater economic equality. Economic support and opportunities would be the best way to sort of help create racial equality. Now, here's the problem with that argument, right? That race and racism can basically be reduced to class and classism. And if we were to have a classless society in which there is no upper and lower class, there's just one equal class, that we wouldn't have racism anymore. Problem with that is that we see racism directed against even the upper middle class Black community, even against the wealthiest members of the Black community. That racism doesn't seem, in fact, to go away with increased economic power. That racism has taken on, and perhaps always has had, an element that has nothing to do with class or economics, but is purely cultural. Right? That the superiority that is achieved through racism is not just economic superiority, but also cultural superiority. And that even if there were total economic equality, there would still be that drive for cultural superiority. So we have to find some synthesis of these two explanations, right? Race reductionism, class reductionism. And I think that Fanon does an excellent job at this, at analyzing both the economic and cultural dimension of racism. So why is race economic? Well, we saw this a little bit in the last video. And I just mentioned it also, right? That racism has an economic function in that it justifies the oppression of a group of people. If a group of people can be oppressed, that is an economic opportunity. So if I can colonize the West Indies, then I can extract their resources, make money, and while I'm at it, I can colonize, enslave, and force into labor the people of the colonized country. All of that is justified through racism. Right? Well, the people of Martinique, the people of Senegal, they are inferior, and so right? It's all right to colonize them. And it's here that we really see the disconnect between idealism and materialism, right? Because uh, what do they say about colonization, right? Colonization is for the good of the colonized, right? It is to bring civilization to these colonized peoples and countries, to introduce them to Christianity, to introduce them to technology, to capitalism, to global market, to European culture, European arts, etc., to civilize. And that civilizing force is a benevolent force in the eyes of the European. So they can tell themselves, because of this idea of race, that colonization is in fact a benefit because Europeans are superior and they are sharing their superior power, their superior culture with the colonized. Right? So they can justify the subjugation and oppression of the people, right? Because they're inferior, they are subhuman. Right? This kind of colonization is justifiable. And at the same time, they can tell themselves that what they're doing is not uh, bad, but in fact, actually good. Right? That the colonized are benefiting from being colonized, right? Because they're getting culture, they're becoming civilized. Um, so this is the idealist sort of view, right? Say we're civilizing, but the material reality is, as Fanon so forcefully points out, plunder. Right? Materially, what's happening is plunder, is enslavement and the extraction of resources that should belong to the people. And we can think about um, just that very idea from a Marxist perspective. Go back to the discussion we were having in class the other week. Uh, to whom do material resources belong? If you buy a plot of land that has an oil well on it, should you have the right to own all the wealth that we've produced by that oil well? Um, I think colonialism gives us a window into property in this sense, right? If you're a European colonizer and you come to Martinique and you buy a massive sugar plantation and you work the land, right? Or rather, you have the natives work the land. Why shouldn't you own the profits of that land? You bought that land. You came. You conquered. You bought that land. That's your land, right? According to the law, you bought the land. That's your land. This is, right, I think, one of Fanon's major points. No, the land belongs to the people. The land belongs to the people that inhabit that land, that worked that land before you came. And the fact that you bought it is just a sign of your ability to use your capital to continue to enrich yourself at the expense of those without capital, those without money. So the original acquisition of the land, the fact that land becomes the property of this one individual, a European who is not even from Martinique, is a major problem. the resources, means of production, the land, should belong to the people, not to whoever has the ability to buy it and profit from it. So, where the hell was I? So Fanon is looking for this synthesis of an economic and a cultural and psychological analysis of racism. Uh, and right, we're on the economic side of this. The concept of race justifies colonialism. That colonialism is idealistically about civilizing and materially about plunder. I think I mentioned in the last video also the way that race functions within capitalism in general, which is that, well, no, maybe I didn't. I think it was maybe in the Marx video. Right? Capitalism demands that there is a certain segment of the population who are unemployed, who are poor. Right? Capitalism as competition demands a loser. There will always be some losers. Now, what's the best way to ensure that you are never a loser? It is to demarcate a group within society who can be easily identified, say, by the color of their skin, and turn them into a permanent underclass to make sure that they are always on the losing end of the competition. So that racism is a way of fixing a group of people to always be the working class. Right? As long as there is racism, then there will be little complaint among the whites, the majority population in the United States, although that's changing quickly. Little complaint among the whites about the oppression and exploitation of the black population. And as long as there's racism, right, that black population can be mercilessly exploited. Obviously, this is what happens with slavery, right? What is America? America is a country built by slaves. The wealth of the United States was created by slave labor. America is not America if not for slave labor. Right? America is built on the backs of enslaved Africans. Right? So, that's the most obvious example of wealth being created for the ruling class by the exploitation and oppression of this underclass. And you can see that that oppression and exploitation is sort of left undisturbed, isn't complained about, as long as there is racism to justify it. So racism is a great benefit uh, for those who want to make money through exploitation and oppression. Um, and we see then again, right, that after the end of slavery, uh, racism comes back, and that oppression and exploitation take different forms. And right, people continue to make huge amounts of money off of the exploitation and oppression of the Black population, and racism continues to right prevent anyone from really complaining about it, right, among the white population. Uh, so you have, former slave plantations turn into sharecropper organizations where Black workers are paid, next to nothing. They live on the premises, are, in everything but name and a sort of token payment to make it legal, still practically slaves, right? So, in many ways, the exploitation and oppression of the Black community continues, almost unaltered after slavery. Of course, the end of slavery is an enormous event and is a huge triumph for anti-racism in general, and it was brought about by, in addition to, uh, the sort of actual problem of maintaining slaves, right, dealing with right, runaway slaves and slave revolts. It was brought about by the complaints um, of white people, right? So anti-racism, but then the white population that was complaining about slavery stopped complaining because slavery was over, and new forms of exploitation and oppression continue. And we see this again and again, right? Exploitation and oppression find new ways to express themselves. Now, so this function of racism within the economy as a means of securing a constant underclass, and of exploiting that underclass horribly, profit, uh, is one of the main functions of racism. The term that people use these days is racial capitalism. And the idea is essentially that you can't separate racism and capitalism. And this will also include, colonization, as an essential part of capitalism. So, race and economics, but if it were true, if it were possible to create this classless society in which everyone has economic equality, uh, the question is, would racism continue? And I think from Fanon's perspective, the answer is yes. That racism is something that operates not just at sort of national historical level, where you would analyze the connection between race and class, but that racism having been essentially brought into being for the sake of economics, colonial exploitation, slavery, and capitalist underclass, is then internalized, psychologized, and becomes operational at the level of the individual. So that after however many hundreds of years, 200-300 years of race relations, of the idea of race, that our identities are caught up in this idea of race. And that racism then becomes an interpersonal, not just economic problem. And that no matter how rich or how equal economically the Black population will be, there is this idea now of white supremacy, white superiority, based on this pseudoscientific reading of history that can't be eradicated simply through economic means. There has to be a psychological and cultural component to this. So you need to fight racism as a psychological fact in sort of the way that the race reductionists do, but also to treat racism as a function of the economy, the way the class reductionists do. Okay. So I'm going to pause here and then we'll talk in the next video about the text a little bit more.